to the first talk in the 2014-15 Pondering Excellence series. And we are a small, intimate group, so Travis, I'm going to take a minute and let people introduce themselves quickly.
That's what I was going to have.
Okay. Well, you want me to just introduce you and then you can take over?
It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm Janet Carlson, the Executive Director of the Center, and the point of these talks, which we have once a month, is to actually engage in conversation about excellence in teaching as provoked by our speaker of the day, who generally shares some of his or her research and gets us thinking. And today we're honored to have Travis Bristol, who's relatively new in returning to the Stanford campus as a postdoctoral fellow in the center, it's right below us, and actually over in Barnum too, but the Center for Opportunity, Policy, and Education. And are you going to talk a little bit more about some of your other background, or do you want me to do that?
Feel free. You're on a roll.
So, I think one of the exciting things about Travis's work is that before you did the research that you've done, you lived the world that you've been studying. He was a STEP fellow, or STEP graduate, and taught in a variety of schools on the East Coast. And then, I'm going to get the chronology probably a little truncated, but essentially went to Boston Teacher Residence Program as a mentor and graduate school. Is that overlapping?
So I did graduate school at Teachers College.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply you were in
Yes.
graduate school there.
Yeah.
But you did the two
Yes.
tasks
Yes.
in an overlapping fashion.
Yes.
So, and now he's doing a couple of years as a postdoc here at Stanford to, I guess, take the next step in that journey about understanding how we improve education.
Yes.
And I'll save the specifics for your talk.
Okay. Thank you.
So Pam, you want to introduce yourself next, and then we'll leave ourselves with our way
I'm
around.
Pam Grossman, and I'm the faculty director of the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching.
I'm Mary Hooser. I'm a second-year PhD student in curriculum and teacher education.
And the three of those guys, they're all in that English language arts category.
Yes.
I'm Brad Fogo. I'm a clinical researcher here at CSET. I also work for the Stanford Research Education.
I'm Diane Friedlander. I'm a colleague with Travis's. I'm a senior researcher at Stanford.
Oh, cool. We're excited to have you here. And Lindsay, you want to do a quick introduction?
Oh,
Since you're not invisible back there, you're real.
Oh, okay. So I'm Lindsay. I just graduated from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia with an Asian Studies major. And I'm hoping that later in life I could use my Japanese as a translator.
Right, Travis, we're turning over.
We have one more.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, what are the 12 questions?
Who are you?
My name is Janine Rupa. I'm an instructional coach with Aspire Public Schools. Is there...
That's great.
Okay.
And so, as Janet said, my name is Travis Bristol, and I'm currently a research and policy fellow at SCOPE. Proud STEPI 2004. Teacher in the University Public Schools, and most recently a teacher educator at the Boston Teacher Residency program. So I really see my work as being sort of situated at this sort of intersection of research, practice, and policy. And so so the way in which I see my work will sort of guide the presentation for today. And so I'll spend some time briefly talking about my dissertation, which was a qualitative interview on the school-based experiences of 27 Black male teachers across 14 schools in BBS. And then I'll talk about how findings from that dissertation influenced PD that I designed. Because I was living in the world of practice, but also conducting my research, I was able to sort of put into practice some of the findings that sort of I came upon while doing my research. And then I'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about how the practice that I designed began to sort of influence policy across the district, particularly as it relates to creating structures to support and retain teachers of color. It's important to, as we think about teachers of color, there is this sort of narrative that having teachers of color, particularly male teachers of color, can improve the outcomes for boys, particularly boys of color. And so there is this larger question about there is the supply of these teachers. And so much of the conversation is thinking about how do we get more. But in order to think about how we get more, it's important to first understand how many there are. And so to do that, I turn to no other than Secretary Arnie Duncan.
It's a pleasure to be here today to do something which I think we do too little of in the field of education, and that is to celebrate success. As many of you know, historically black colleges and universities, including Xavier, were established a century ago for the purpose of training a generation of black teachers. Nationwide, 35% of public school students are black or Hispanic, but less than 15% of our teachers are black or Latino. It is especially troubling that less than 2% of our nation's teachers are African American males.
So, as Secretary Duncan points out, less than 2%, only 9% of all teachers in the U.S. Are black men. Latino male teachers account for about 2% of all teachers. And often in this narrative about teachers of color, we rarely talk about Asian teachers. And so given this idea that having more male teachers of color can improve the outcomes of boys, we know that Southeast Asian males in many centers have the same outcomes as black and Latino boys. So we also need to think about recruitment efforts, particularly targeted at Asian males and other research, future research agenda, if you will. But if we look at this, we see that there is a gap, right? That while slightly more than half of all students are white in the public schools, we have more than 3/4 of all white teachers. So there is this sort of gap that exists between student demographics and sort of teacher demographics.
Correct.
But yes, yes,
Can I ask a follow-up question?
yes.
I'm assuming this is K-12 data.
This is K-12, yes.
Have you ever seen it disaggregated, so you can either look at secondary compared to elementary or high school compared to K-8? And in general, does the pattern hold, or does the female-male ratio at least change a little?
Yeah, so at the secondary level, there are men tend to be more concentrated in the secondary level, but still there is this.
And do we get any shift in the men of color?
No. Well, so that I don't know. But particularly in the secondary sort of setting, there are many more men than there are women. But I think this begs sort of the larger question about, one, why should we care? Why should we care that this gap exists? A couple months ago, I was on a radio program in Boston where Boston, because of the sort of desegregation order, they're grappling with this issue much more than other urban districts. And the host asked us this question, right? Are we in a situation where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids? And so I turn that question over to you. I'll ask you to sort of the person sitting next to you to spend about 30 seconds each person sharing your response to this question, and then we'll sort of come back. So given this gap between teacher characteristics and student characteristics that relates to race and gender, why should we care? And are we in a situation where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids?
Yeah.
Late on me.
Yeah, I think we're in a situation where we need black teachers teaching white kids.
I was going to say, it's a both and.
Yeah, it's both and I think that children need to be exposed to a range of people within our society.
Yeah, people that look like them, came from where they came from, and people that don't.
Right.
And all these people.
Right. Right. That said, there's something about the power dynamics connection to race. It's particularly important to have more teachers of color. So, I was a part that we had more teachers white teachers, I think that would be the best. But given the
Administrators, you can't move all the whites to administration.
Right. Exactly.
And then I think that when you talk about the power structure thing, I think there's a gender piece to it too. Because as long as teaching stays relatively female profession, it changes.
If my own identity has
It needs to or should,
Right,
but
right,
it
it does, and I also think it changes.
So I want to encourage you, if the other person in your partner, in your peer share, if they have not spoken, it's now about a good time for the other person to share.
You know, I think also the gender thing also
it's still
changes kinds of
so
No, it just changes.
It does impact them.
Yeah. Well, and I see that when I look at the elementary schools in districts that have a lot of men in upper administration. You'll see change happen faster at high schools than elementary schools. I mean, there are exceptions to this. There's
Yeah.
patterns.
There are.
I'm curious what Travis's answer is.
Yeah.
Because it feels like if we took this literally, we're going back to certification.
Yeah, and you know, it's such a big deal. Other teachers, not but the health of black community, whether black teachers teach black children, black doctors, black children, there was and there's such strong socioeconomic segregation. It's racial segregation now that the black community impoverished communities.
About 10 more seconds.
You know, and so I think that's
Yeah, I think it complicates it.
that's complicated. Yes, exactly.
Then to realize.
Exactly. So appreciative of that. I just have that image.
And just think of it as normal.
It's just fine. It's not. So
It's got a pretty strong, is it white and white?
it's changing.
yeah. I've been a few meetings in the morning.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no. This is not a
All right, so I'll ask maybe one person from each group to share something that you found particularly profound, something that you rubbed you the wrong way. So anyone, any group can begin. So are we in a situation where we need black teachers teaching black kids and white teachers teaching white kids?
Well, I don't think we disagree at all. So, so I think we both felt like in the ideal situation, white children would be learning from black teachers, and black children would be learning from black teachers. And I mean, I think we felt like children need to be exposed to teachers from all different backgrounds, and that's really important to understand or to live in the multicultural society that we are. But in light of the power imbalance, to err on the side of more teachers of color than fewer would be a positive thing.
Back.
We had a very kind of similar conversation in that regard. Did you want to add what you were saying?
Yeah, and if you're a student that, so if you're a black student or a student of color, and you see principals and the teachers not looking like you, but the support staff or the janitors looking like you, it sends subconscious message to students.
So we had a similar conversation towards the end. So I like to believe that parents treat it as children having the opportunity to learn from those teachers who are with them.
So there, so this idea of having a diverse workforce, right, might be important for children to have adults who look like them. And so recently, with this idea of thinking about teacher effects on students, researchers have looked at, have used experimental research design to really test to what degree might having the same race teacher influence outcomes. So Tom Eagles here looked at the Tennessee class size study and found that when a student had a same race teacher, there were improved outcomes for English and math. Ozad, who looks at ECLSK, found that having a same race, that when a student had a same race teacher, they were more likely to be assessed higher. And a more recent study in the American Economic Review looked at administrative data here at a school very nearby here and found that when a student at a community college had a same race teacher, the performance gap between students of color closed with their white peers. And there was also some sort of effects in terms of retention and graduation. And so there is this idea, now that we can sort of measure this, that it might be the case that having the same race teacher might well increase the outcomes for students. Now, at the same time, where we have researchers talking about this sort of value added, if you will, of teachers of color, for students of color, that they have a teacher of color. Richard Ingersoll, when he analyzed the SAS, the School and Staffing Survey, found that male teachers were more likely to leave. So here you have this conversation where researchers are saying that there is a value added for having teachers of color. Then you have Richard Ingersoll saying that these teachers are actually leaving, male teachers of color are leaving at a disproportionate rate. And so I became interested maybe in shifting the conversation, not only thinking about recruitment, right, but also thinking about the workplace experiences and retention for, in this case, black male teachers. This is a Kwani Duncan in 2011 going to Morehouse and launched Black Male Teacher Recruitment Campaign, Bring Black Men to the Blackboard. Is it only about recruitment, or should we also be thinking about retention, given, of course, Virginia Ingersoll's work? And so I designed a study to find out what were the experiences of black male teachers and their decisions to stay or leave. And so I asked two questions. My dissertation had four. I'll just talk about these two here. What were sort of the school-based experiences of black male teachers, and how might the school organizational context affect black male teachers' decisions to stay or leave? And in the study, I interviewed 27 black male teachers, as I said, two sort of semi-structured interviews at 14 schools, 7 schools with one black male teacher, 7 schools with maybe more black male teachers. The year before I did this qualitative interview, I designed a survey for black male teachers in Boston, and after I disaggregated the data from that survey, I found that the number of black men in the building seemed to influence their experience in the building. So that's why I have two types of schools, one school with one black male teacher and one school with many more. Yes?
Are these elementary or secondary
Both.
schools?
Both. And so these were some of my findings across all teachers. So Dennis Sangister, who is an 8th grade English teacher, talked about this idea of sitting in on a faculty meeting, sitting in on a grade team meeting, and believing or perceiving that his colleagues did not see him as being intelligent as they were. So he says, I mean, it makes you feel inadequate. Like, am I saying something that's crazy? I've been educated, I have a master's, I've passed Massachusetts, the Massachusetts sort of licensure exam, it's frustrating, you know. And so there seemed to be this pattern that for Black male teachers that there were some particular socio-emotional challenges that made it challenging for them to navigate their schooling experiences. This idea of being perceived as being sort of intellectually inferior.
So were there perceptions based on really explicit people saying things like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, or were they subtler or a whole range?
So teachers would say, so in this case, this teacher talked about sort of sharing a comment and his colleagues not necessarily listening to his comment. In other cases, there was another teacher who talked about being chair of the English department. And this teacher was not, he spoke English, he was from Nigeria, spoke English, grew up, went to a prep school in England. But this idea that because he was not based in the US, that therefore he wasn't competent enough to, one, be chair of the English department, and two, he disregarded the edicts that he would send out to his colleagues. So it was, those were some of the perceptions that participants had, that they believed their colleagues thought they were intellectually inferior. So there are these sort of social-emotional challenges, right, around being a Black male teacher. And then there was also this idea of their practice not being valued, or their understanding of practice. And so participants talked about that they believed their colleagues saw them more as behavior managers than teachers, that they were there just to police the misbehaving kids. And so Jermaine Carter talks about, I can see most people would feel enthused that they're helping out their colleagues. He's talking about one of his colleagues who routinely sends misbehaving boys to his class. And he says, they pick me because they respect me, but it's also becoming a burden now, because I have to do other things. I have to plan with the kids, that they track, plan my school in sequence, and correct papers, just the regular things that teachers do. Right? And so on the one hand, there is this sense on the one hand, there are these sort of social-emotional challenges that Black male teachers face by dint of being Black men, and there's also this other sense that their knowledge and their knowledge about their practice isn't valued, that they're just to police the misbehaving kids. And so, one recommendation was then to design a PD for Black male teachers, in fact, extension teachers of color. We can talk about that. That addressed both their socio-emotional challenges and their practice. And so we know, of course, that we improve organizations when we grow both the people and the organization. I'm happy to talk at the end about some of my suggestions about the organization. But now I'm focusing specifically on the people, right? And so to help the people, I designed this professional development to address some of the unique experiences of Black male teachers. And so, as I said, I was a clinical teacher, educator at the Boston Teacher Residency Program. I spent about 3 days a week in schools, working with residents. And so I was clearly had a clear sense of some of the challenges that many of the teachers of color, male teachers of color were facing. So this PD was also in response to that. The mission of the PD was to provide social and emotional support to teachers and a space to reflect on practice, of course, in services to learning. Meetings took place on Friday evenings from about 5 to 7. The first half of the meeting was sort of focused on this idea of social emotional support, and then the second half of the meeting was focused on having a participant share a dilemma in his practice and getting feedback from the participants. An obvious question is, what might be some of the potential barriers or drawbacks for designing a PD session based on the teacher's sort of social location? So I'll ask you to turn and talk with the person sitting next to you. What do you see as some of the potential barriers or drawbacks of designing a PD based on a teacher's sort of social location?
So they don't get the same thing is true. Rachel was, I wouldn't say racist, major issue. So,
I would say that I think there's definitely a divisiveness that can happen in culture at school, and kind of people want that. It seems always about being responsible. What about us? We're a group. Why don't we? We never did anything special for us. We needed help. We were new teachers. So you know, I can imagine you feel like that, not understanding again the power dynamics. And again, then, you know, yeah, just so that divide, sense of, oh, those guys all get to talk, you know, and they're probably talking about us, you know, probably happens. So, it seems like you need or plus facilitated all staff conversation about it. At least like, let's put it on the table. We're doing this because there's a need, because these guys are feeling so I would think like that's the kind of idea.
yeah, that would be. And imagine if the conversation was in color was. There was a time when I think we thought colorblind was the right thing to do.
I wonder about the idea.
And there are schools where it's explicit. There's not small.
So now it's the time for maybe someone else in the group to sort of maybe share potential drawbacks that you might see designing this.
Oh, okay. We're good at the
We
back.
don't have that
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the challenges when you have explicit whole school conversations again is there's always a challenge. Because she's of color are the minority of almost every school staff. But then any software becomes the representative of their race.
Yeah, it's a version of stereotype.
Giving the African American perspective right now when we're talking about schools. So that could be really hard, I think. Right. We would plan. Who was in and out of only for the function model.
Right, right.
Considered that.
Yeah, but because of this work, it makes me think it's a good starting place for these target population. Numbers are terrible. You can't pretend there isn't a problem.
Right.
So that tells me, okay, we can do BTR.
So let me just, I think I took for granted that people knew a little bit about BTR. So BTR is an urban residency program. It's in its 13th year. And teachers spend 4 days a week at the school site. The content methods class that I co-taught happens at the school site. And then they spend 1 day taking other classes. And so for this professional development, I invited initially all of the male teachers of color who were in the BTR pipeline. So these were pre-service teachers, as well as teachers who were probably in the second, third, fourth, fifth year. And so the PD was not necessarily school-based. It was targeted to people in the BTR pipeline. The teachers came, from different schools across Boston. But potential barriers. I heard I heard you use the word sort of divisive. So maybe have people talk a little bit about that, about potential barriers or drawbacks, because of course, in doing the work, there were some that became very apparent. But what are the potential drawbacks and barriers to talk about?
So I was extrapolating from my experience being in a book club that's all women, or a hobby club that is women, and it's empowering, and yet it also has a possibility to have a us and them type of mentality.
You want to add your comment about the perception of others in the school?
Yeah, so I think there can be some kind of jealousy, divisiveness that can often, if it's a group of color, then the white folks will say, well, what about us? Why don't we never get a special group? And we had challenges too, so there's that kind of ignorance, I would say, about the power dynamics and the reality of the experience of the group of color that can happen.
We talked a little bit about, I guess you could call this a drawback, but we framed it more as a limitation. Whereas if you are, what I'm presuming in this instance, talking about issues that are social and issues that involve not just teachers of color, but white teachers as well, that you, if you're only going to be working with one group, you're limited by missing an opportunity to have a more integrated group, because ultimately it will be a more integrated group that's going to be part of a possibly more powerful solution to the issue.
We talked about how, again, on one hand, it provides that safe space, and on the other hand, Aaron pointed out it could also be potentially creating a stigma that it suggests there's a problem, that the teachers of color are a problem that requires a special solution. That could be a potential drawback to it in terms of perception.
And I think that these are all, this idea of a stigma, this idea of us versus them, why this group versus why this group, teachers of color versus white teachers, was something that we were sort of very aware of, particularly given Boston's historical challenge around race. But there was also this idea that the very teachers who we had a sense, right, and putting that empirically, right, could potentially improve outcomes, and were being pushed out of the profession. We need to first give attention to thinking about supporting them. And then, sort of, to your point, Brad, and then find ways to use the lessons learned to feed back to the larger organization, so that white teachers, for example, might understand some of the challenges. But yes, it's really the ultimate need of. But I think it's important for us to sort of talk about that.
Just curious, Travis, why the framing of the question this way, I would imagine that we could have also talked about what would be the possible benefits of providing PPP to teachers.
Yeah.
And so just your thinking behind the framing of the question this way.
I'm going to spend some time talking about what I believe to be the benefits, but I think it's important to, in Boston's context, and I think even sort of this larger narrative where people are talking about this idea of supporting teachers or getting more teachers of color, I think that there is this us versus them. And I think that this framing this question this way allows people to recognize that yes, it might be us versus them, and allows us to have the conversation and also think about how the lessons learned from this particular group might inform the larger work happening in schools and districts. So I think it forces us to maybe hear some things that we think might be potentially problematic about this sort of homogenous group. So, like I said, the PD was sort of framed. Part of the PD was based on sort of like socio-emotional component. The other was about sort of this dilemma of practice. Typically, what happened there, I chose two facilitators, and at the end of each meeting, I asked the group what they wanted to talk about during the next meeting. Particularly for the dilemma of practice, what happened is that the teacher was asked to bring a piece of an artifact, video, typically video, sometimes it was sort of student work that we would sort of talk about. I'm going to zoom in on the February meeting. And so during the February meeting, we spoke about what's the role of male teachers of color in educating boys of color. And so for me, this question was, I think, particularly, I was taken aback by the question because what I realized was that there is this perception that that participants believe or sense that the principals felt that if I just hired these guys, they would know what to do. And in this very safe space, right, the teachers of color said, well, I don't know what to do, right? And where would I have learned it, right? I say, you know, I went to STEP. I think there was one of the best teacher ed programs. But around this time, 10 years ago, I graduated from STEP 2004 in October. Around this time, 10 years ago, right after Columbus, when magically the rosters changed, I saw that there were many more boys coming into my class. And they were coming in because they were having challenges with the other class, and magically I was supposed to know how to do something with them, but where would I have learned how to do something with them? I mean, there wasn't a space for that. And so in this space, participants were able to sort of talk about, you know, what they imagined their role might be in helping boys of color. And so I'll play with this video. One of the things that participants talked about was this idea of what they call valuing the cool. And you'll hear a participant use the word swag. Anyone know what swag?
Swagger, right?
Like what, sorry?
No, it's an actual acronym. It's an acronym.
Okay, what?
I can't remember what it stands for, but it's like with the junk you get free.
Yeah, we all.
Is that how you're using it? Or
No, so I've never heard it that way. That's why I was curious. I was like, okay, let me hear more, because maybe there might have been some sort of knowledge that I hadn't heard of.
You know, like when you get a bag at a conference
Yes.
or a keychain,
That's
it's called
kids.
swag.
That's not how kids
Yeah,
talk.
okay, so this is like the kid
Okay.
terminology.
Yeah.
Okay. So particularly in urban centers, but I think it's been sort of appropriated into pop culture, swag is like this idea of having confidence. Right? So students talk.
Swagger?
Yes,
Oh.
So students talk about this idea to have swag means to sort of be very confident, like everyone wants to have swag. And so this teacher here talks about how he's using this word swag in his class.
Aligned with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, you know, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But you know, in students' context, it's something different.
So this is Greg. Greg was one of the facilitators. What do you hear? Maybe I'll play it one more time and I'll ask him. What do you hear Greg saying? What's he saying? What's he doing with this idea of swag, particularly as it relates to connecting to Black people?
Aligned with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, you know, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But you know, in students' context, it's something different.
What do you hear Greg saying or suggesting?
That there's the students, in the student culture, there's a particular understanding of what's cool or what's swag, and that means that in his classroom, he's trying to advocate this notion of math swag. That is an academic,
Yeah.
his version of cool is an academic, that it's in somebody's attention with the students.
Yeah. And he's used this idea of swag, right, as an acronym for, so it's now become an acronym. The students will achieve great gains. And so in his class, right, to be a scholar, right, is to achieve great gains. So he's appropriated this term into his class. This is another teacher, so building off of Greg, talking about his work as an English teacher.
Your ideas with evidence. So one of the
He's
things.
talking about linking this to some of the work he's doing with the Common Core.
Your ideas with evidence. So one of the things that, you know, I hear kids say often is, you know, like, oh, he's sick with it. So what I did is I took the Common Core, you know, supporting ideas with evidence and changed it to supporting ideas with quotes. So when kids are in class and they, you know, saying some opinionated stuff, I'm like, nah, you're not sick with it yet. Like, you're not ready, you know? I need you to get sick with it. And, you know, sit in front of my classroom, and I want the kids to go back to the text, and then find it in there, and, you know, so it's like you were saying, you gotta listen to what they're saying and be creative. I think that's the hardest part, is being creative enough to mesh the two.
So for me, what was interesting here was that you know, participants are saying in their school settings that their colleagues don't necessarily see them or value or see them as intellectually inferior. But in this space, they were able both to sort of like normalize the work that they're doing, you know, hear that other people are also doing the same thing, and then also maybe receive some strategies.
I think what's also really powerful about it is that they're not having to kind of appropriate a white middle class style of speech in the classroom to be successful. But they're able to, well, I don't know if they can, but in this space anyway, that they can, you know, they don't have to do a lot of code switching in their language, and so that they can connect to students at that level.
Yes, or have to explain in an English department meeting why he decided to use sick with it, right? That in this space, people
Space
will,
they can,
right?
yeah. And in their classroom.
Yeah.
So that, and this gets you to abstract this Taylor. One of the ponderings I had watching the teacher talk about this is one of the reasons I think he can do that is because he's like the kids. If you put somebody my age, gender, and color in there, and I try to appropriate their language, even if I'm going to do it to build a particular academic culture, I don't know if I can pull it off this well. I mean, I think there are other things I can do to engage kids, but I'm wondering how much of what you can take from culture is allowed because you have some connection to that culture.
That's a good question. Sorry, what's your name?
I'm Catherine. Sorry,
Catherine.
I'm even late. I think part of what they're doing that's valuable is just listening to the students, hearing what they're saying, and using it. So I think whether or not we would be able to use these exact same strategies might not matter as much, but just that what they're doing is really listening and hearing their students. And maybe a white teacher could do that in a different way. But I thought it was also interesting how they were able to talk about it among themselves, and maybe that would give them kind of the ability to then go and bring it back to their English department later on. Like, okay, I've presented this to my small state group. Now I'm going to go talk to my department chair about using this method, which could work for. I mean, it could transfer to other teachers as well. They're not.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think Catherine's point is a good one because I think one of the things that I heard from participants in the research was that they said that what they were doing with students wasn't particularly novel, right? But their colleagues thought that because they were Black men, that there was something unique about it. They said they just spent time listening to their students. They got to know their students. So it wasn't about being a Black male that made them, that sort of kept the ship steady.
Can I just add one more point? But with that came, there's an implied assumption of respect for students that's coming across, that they respect that the language that the students use is legitimate. Whereas a teacher who's from a different culture may consider it a street language that's not appropriate in the classroom or whatever, and not respect it as legitimate language. And so it is listening and using it, but it's also, there's a level of respect.
Yes. So this idea, the role then of a male teacher of color here, right, was that we aren't necessarily, there isn't something unique about us, right, but it's this idea of listening to students, right, and valuing what students are saying. And that might then be the work that we should be playing in the lives of.
So then aren't you in danger of saying good teaching is just good teaching? Which I get is a true statement, but doesn't it work against the idea of changing population dynamics of our teacher corps?
Does everyone understand Janet's and what you would think?
When you share data with us that it actually mean, there's research that shows that teachers of the same ethnicity are impacted.
Yeah, so there's more to it than just being a teacher.
Right, yes. But there might be moves, there might be strategies that can go across all teachers. And we can learn that by bringing more people from this particular subgroup into the profession.
Or it may just be the importance again of having like role model that, I mean, I think about the fact that I went to college and never thinking about my professor. Because in 4 years of college, I had one female professor. And she was single and no family, and I thought, I don't think I want to know that, that's not for me. Never dawned on me to think about that. So again, thinking about the power, and it didn't have anything to do with the teaching strategies, because again, that ability is to imagine the possible self. And the only way you can imagine that future is if you see people who are like you, who are safe. So it seems to me that it's both about the strategies and the teaching, but it's about something.
And so this idea that the first part then of our meetings were structured around some social emotional support, but we include teaching and learning, and we focus on teaching and learning. And so it was also important to talk about dilemmas of practice and giving teachers some strategies to address their dilemmas of practice. Here, Barack, he's presenting, he's a first grade teacher. The meetings, like I said, happened, there were monthly meetings, and the meetings happened in the classroom of the teacher. It was important to get a sense of insight into the teacher's classroom world by being in their classroom course. So this is a first grade class. And so Barack is presenting, he's teaching a math lesson. This is the video here. And I'll just show you.
In the video was, I think, the boy from Cisco and Georgie. It seemed like they were conversing about the answers that you were asking for, and I saw that they were like engaged in the content, going over the sheets and looking back to your instruction. Like, challenging kid, but I do think it could possibly be something in the class where maybe we always converse more.
Were you, this is Brett, he's a pre-service teacher, were you here with Brett? Should I play it one more time?
But in the video was, I think, the boy from Cisco and Georgie. It seemed like they were conversing about the answers that you were asking for, and I saw that they were like engaged in the content, going over the sheets and looking back to your instruction. Like, challenging kid, but I do think it could possibly be something in the class where maybe we always converse more.
So Barack's dilemma is, how do I engage boys? And did you hear what Brett's suggestion was to Barack? It's like oh, right from there, I did.
I think he said he noticed
Yes.
2 boys in the class talking,
Yeah.
and that he suggested that the teacher provide more opportunities.
Yes. Yes. This was like, yeah. So he was suggesting essentially think your share. And so he noticed that when students were talking, and he cut off their talk, their ability to sort of make sense of the task. And so he's suggesting that maybe give students maybe more time to sort of think about the task before you even assess what they know and what they don't know. Now, what I thought, so that's clearly a strategy that Barack can take into his class and use. What I thought was also interesting, Brett, who at this point, Brett was a pre-service teacher, so I was co-teaching the ELA Content Methods course. And this is in February, and this was the first time, maybe the second time, that I heard Brett really share any, when he demonstrated any sort of understanding of the complexity around teaching and learning. And so for me, as a teacher educator, it was fascinating that in this space, that he clearly understood the complexity of teaching and learning and was able to sort of give this much more veteran teacher, right? Because I think Brad was in his 3rd or 4th year, maybe some insight into his own practice. So there was something that I recognized that I and my colleague might not have been doing in in our own sort of pre-service space to encourage this. But again, it's this sort of it's the strategy of maybe doing a peer share that you see Barack sort of taking note of. I should say that the way that we structured the second half of the meeting on the practice, we use the ISSA protocol, right, from the National School Reform Faculty, which essentially has the presenter share his dilemma of practice. The group will then ask sort of clarifying questions to the presenter, presenter then answers, and then the group then sort of helps the presenters give them sort of insight around this dilemma of practice. Here goes.
I think that was mathematically correct, though.
Yeah.
And it was like, it wasn't the answer that you were looking for.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, because she said, oh, it reminds me of a square. It's one of the signs of a
Square or
square.
an L shape?
Yeah.
Yes.
And she didn't say, like, it's an L. And it was like she was so enthusiastic to say it. And then it's like, not you squashed her, but it was like, oh, it's not the answer.
No, I get what you're saying. I remember that I was hoping that she would say something that's more simplified for the class. But I think, I don't know, I forgot what I did, whether I acknowledged it or I just didn't add comment to it.
Yeah, so, I mean, I know, I wouldn't know how to do it from an elementary standpoint, but in a high school standpoint, it's like, how do you roll with the answer to get it to where you want it to be, rather than just alright.
Yeah,
no, I don't know what to even call it, but like, you know, if she is like that higher skilled in thinking already, having her elaborate on that more, but what's a different way to say that?
Yeah, totally. Say more about that. What do you
no, but I mean that's what's kind of stuck out. Me being a math teacher, that's just right. Like,
no.
So what would you hear Greg, who's a ninth grade teacher, suggesting to Barack, his first grade teacher? What would you hear him saying, suggesting?
It seemed like be open to more, that there isn't just like the one right answer, that students may have another take on something than you thought in your head as a teacher they were supposed to, and to notice every like subtlety of your response might deflate a student who actually had a more sophisticated answer than the teacher was anticipating. Just the teacher thought, well, the other kids might not understand that. He didn't kind of build off of it, but to let her be the teacher for a second, or you know.
So follow students' thinking, choose students' values, their ability to be sense makers. So in the March meeting, one of the things that we talked about was how do I navigate the various roles I'm asked to play. One of the sort of the takeaways was this idea of developing or having a script. So I know that, for example, I'm asked maybe to be the dean of discipline in my school by dint of my social location, male of color, and maybe a strategy then might be to put a response in writing and tell your colleague, listen, these are my priorities. I have to prepare my students to pass the FCAS, the state exam. I would have loved to watch students during my prep period, but I can't at this sort of moment. And so it was very helpful for participants to really have like a script. So I know that tomorrow and the next week I will be faced with these particular roles, and now I have something in my back pocket with which to help them navigate these particular challenging spaces. Another part of the March meeting, people were again curious about how do I make my curriculum culturally relevant. Just because I'm a man of color doesn't necessarily mean that I know how to make my curriculum culturally relevant, although people might think that. And so we had, I won't play this whole video, but Chris Somerville talks about the work that he did making this curriculum culturally relevant by designing an African American history course. Again, this is his class.
I wanted to find out. So if you go in the hallway, you'll see an actual timeline that spans this entire
video, but he talks about creating this sort of timeline in the hallway for students. Now, as the PD went on, one of the things that that participants began to suggest was that they felt too disconnected from students. They came to teaching because they wanted to improve outcomes for students. And so One of the things that they said they wanted to do was to help think about how to get boys of color into the sort of teaching profession. And so during the last meeting of the year, on a hot day in May, the 95-degree day in Boston, in one of the most available schools, English high school, the 25 male students come to a workshops. We had 5 different workshops where the participants themselves led workshops on entering or ideas around the teaching profession.
Exposed to something that you probably don't really know too much about. Maybe you know things about it, but most of these workshops basically debunk a lot of stereotypes.
And so the idea for the workshop, these kind of workshops, was to sort of allow male teachers that they might have known, they might have respected to, as Sinai says, to debunk some of the myths. One of the myths, many people say that male teachers of color, men don't enter the teaching profession because of money, right? That they don't get paid enough. And so one workshop we talked about the sort of economic returns, and one student said that he thought teachers made $25,000 a year, right? And so was shocked to learn that the starting salary in Boston was actually about $56, and so that's more than everyone in my family, right? And so how do you draw people in? You have to potentially get people from something else. Clearly, earlier in the year, this is John McDonough, the district, informed by some of the work that we did with the Boston Teacher Residency, Educators of Color Network, launched a very similar program for male teachers of color in the district. And what they've done is they've paired teachers with male educators in the district office as a way to sort of support them and potentially bring them into the leadership track. And so I initially worked with the district thinking about how to bring this program to scale. I'm currently working with the Office of Human Capital around their expanding this initiative. So first it was one cohort, and now so successful with the first cohort that they're now turning into 2 cohorts. And I recently learned that the principals of color have asked for a similar group to address their needs. We haven't studied that yet, but we have to at some point. Recently I testified at the Boston City Council. Boston, as you know, under the sort of federal segregation order, to have 25% black teachers in the district. And one of the things I've been helping Councilor Jackson, who chairs the education committee, is to sort of move the conversation away from quotas, helping him really, and with the district, understand that there is a value added to having diversity. Diversity drives innovation. And so that's some of the ongoing work that my research that I did on black male teachers, how we inform this practice, this thinking, and how it's also attempt to sort of shape policy in the district. Of course, many people allow me to do this research, paper transcription, and so I just sort of need to thank them for doing that. So thank you. Maybe questions?
I'm interested that, so I think it was really interesting that the executive coaching model built in, but it sounds like it's a pipeline out of the classroom.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, since all of this is about keeping male teachers of color in the classroom, how do you think about that?
Yeah, and so one of the things that I told the district that was a caution, right, that they need to be really mindful of this, because I think that often what happens is that because male teachers of color keep the classroom, keep kids in their chairs, and all of a sudden they're equipped to become leaders without really becoming instructional leaders. And so I've encouraged them to build into their program a place where they're allowing teachers to reflect on practice. One of the dangers, as you know, is I can suggest ideas, but I'm not necessarily at the table, but I can provide some caution. So I've encouraged them to really be attentive to providing teachers with experiences to reflect on their practice. They want principles of color, and so it seems like there's a pipeline, but that's my encouragement to them.
Do you think they're putting as much effort into the recruitment end of the pipeline? And I know you showed that one slide that was on recruitment, but if they're gonna recruit into principals, you also need to recruit into the teacher base.
So is your question, is the district putting their, are they recruiting teachers of color? Is that
Do you think they're putting as much emphasis? Or even as, if you wanna
So-
get analytical, are they doing
Yeah.
as much as you think they should?
So I think so. One part of the study of my study was thinking about how to get more black teachers in. I think that many districts just lack ideas. So I don't think that they know how. One of the things that I found in my study was that many of my participants came to teaching because they had an early experience in teaching. So it might have been doing some work study program in college, working at an after-school program. And so I think that, and so those experiences allowed them to transition into the teaching profession. I think what the district's MO is to go to an historically black college or university and get people in. And so I think that they just lack ideas. And so I've encouraged them to develop their own homegrown pipeline. And so Boston has, we're us. And we know that teachers are more likely to stay in schools, if they are from the places where they went to high school, if it's 12 miles or something. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question about some of the myths that you were working on debunking with the teachers. You said that one of the myths was around the teachers' salaries. What were some of the other myths?
Yeah. So one of the myths was that participants, the students, the high school students, believe that they wouldn't be able to control their students. So if you're at English high school, right, it's a turnaround school, and you see that many of your classes are seemingly chaotic, you believe that if I become a teacher, it'll be equally chaotic. And so I think one of the things that participants said, the participants said to the students, there was that, clearly in our class, because some of them were actually teachers at English, you don't see some of these, the chaos isn't there. And so I think helping them realize that while the chaos might be true in some places, it's not true in all places. And so in the places where it's not true, then maybe you can be that person to keep the badness outside of the classroom. That was one myth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was sort of wondering about pedagogical strategies that they might have heard about or that they might have experienced in their own when they were students, and if that was part of the mythology around teaching that this is the way to teach, and if you did any work with that maybe instead of rote practice and lecture, that they would have some other methods.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so with the high school students there wasn't any sort of maybe attention to what happens in the class or like practice. It was really about like entry into the profession, how much teachers might make, less so about like using cultural relevant pedagogy, for example. Yeah.
So those were myths that high school students had.
Yes. Yeah.
I was wondering if the guys in your study felt some immense burden to be better. If there were a lot of, I'm having trouble wording my question. It feels like there's a lot of weight on their shoulders when I think about the potential difference they could make for kids, and therefore the expectations administrators might have or colleagues might have. And it comes through in a way of, well, here, you take these blackboards because you know how to handle it. Did they feel that? Was there a sort of weight on them?
Well, absolutely, and I think that made the challenge of saying no, I can't take care of the student right now. That made sort of that burden sort of even greater. But I think that for them they probably drove themselves mad because they both had to deal with the sort of added pressure from their colleagues. And so yeah, I think there was a sort of immense burden, and I think that what the PD allowed them to do was to develop some strategies just to sort of navigate some of those burdens.
How much burden level of expectation came from within? I want these boys to succeed.
Yeah. So with the study, so I'm happy, Clay, to talk about my study. As any person does. So my framework was the following answer. It talks about this idea of performance pressure, boundary hiking, and rolling travel. And so for many of the participants, this performance pressure actually came less from their colleagues and more from more from like outside of the school. Like they came to the profession recognizing that they needed to improve the outcomes of some of these students. So they felt the burden was greater from outside of the organization than from inside their colleagues.
Outside being neighborhood, family, church, I mean, what's
Yeah,
our definition of outside?
This sort of societal pressure that you are the chosen, you are the talented tenant to join the voice, that you are uniquely positioned to do this work.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yes.
What about the school? You were going to talk more about the people, but you also talked about sort of the organization.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about you deliberately sampled for teachers in a context where there were more black, more teachers of color, and places where there were fewer.
Yeah.
Did that make a difference?
Yes, it did. So what I found, so I looked at human resource data across the entire district, and I found that schools that had, and this was true across the district, not just true of my sample, that schools that had more black male teachers were schools were more likely to be failing schools. And so the idea, my theory is that these challenging schools need bodies to police students, right, rather than to teach students. Schools that just had one black male teacher tended to be in Boston they're called pilot schools. They have a lot of autonomy. I also found that schools that had many more black male teachers tended to have a black principal. Schools that did not have any black male teachers tended to have a white principal. I suggested to the district that it might well be the case that there is some racial bias around hiring that they need to grapple with. And of course, the deseg order suggested that this was happening in 1974. Yeah.
Did you see, well, maybe you couldn't give this. I'm wondering if there's any HR data on the applicant pool.
I want to follow up on that because that's really, so, because I was interested in whether or not having a larger cohort of male teachers of color was STEM nutrition. Like you might be more likely to say, but if they're in failing schools,
Yes.
that would suggest that they're more likely to leave.
And that was the case.
And that was the case.
That was the case.
So in fact, it was not a protective factor.
No. Yes.
But that's
But
what
it's
figure out,
complicated.
it's complicated because
Right.
of the schools they were in.
Yes.
Did you have any, particularly because you had access, it sounds like, to the whole city database, were there schools that were not failing schools where there were a higher number of male teachers of color that you could look at as a subsample to see if it followed that same pattern?
No. Yeah. So yeah. If it followed the pattern of teachers leaving. Yeah.
Right.
So I was only able to ascertain whether teachers were leaving from the schools in my sample, not looking at data across the district. The only data the district gave me then was where teachers were, not necessarily where they left.
That would be interesting if you could get
Yeah.
access to the administrative data on teachers in the district.
Yeah.
To see if that you can find, because it's difficult because those two things are coherent.
Yes. So the Office of Equity, we were in conversation about maybe doing a round 2 of this study. Which the Office of Equity wants and no one else wants. So because it's, Boston is a particularly interesting place, particularly around race with this deseg order. So I think that this study was very troubling for the district. But I think that the Office of Equity is where we're talking about how we might do a second round of this study, and then maybe look at indeed where people might be leaving, and include a larger sample.
can't change the problem if you don't understand the problem.
Yes, I would agree. But that's easy to say from, at a research space, right, when we're having to negotiate these very challenging.
Any other questions? Well, Travis, thank you.
Thank
That was
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
That's very, yeah, thank you so much. Lots of things to think about.
Yeah. I think he needs to come back and talk to Hollywood.
Exactly. And the Hollyhock teachers.
Well, that's my other thought. So if you were gonna retool this talk to teachers, would you change anything? I don't have an answer in mind.
Yeah.
It's really an open
So if I were going to talk to teachers, both white teachers and teachers
Yeah.
of color,
but in these
I-
top high
yeah.
poverty schools that we're working with.
I would spend time talking about what participants said, what the roles that they were casted into.
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Because I think that's learning for white teachers in this example. Because I think that white teachers weren't sending the misbehaving kids. It wasn't they weren't doing it out of like harm, right? I mean they just thought, right? Well, you clearly have some success, so let me just send them to you. I don't think they recognized the ramifications that participants couldn't eat their lunch, that they couldn't plan, right? I don't think they understood all of those dimensions when they sent the misbehaving boy to these students. So I think that having people understand that this is the unintended consequence of doing this or unintended effect, then I think that they might change when and where they send misbehaving students. Yes, Kevin.
I think it's also really interesting that I missed the beginning of the talk, but it arose from the need of the teachers, right? This group was
Yeah.
something that the teachers kind of requested.
Well,
How did it come about?
It came about through my dissertation research. So while I was talking to teachers, I heard that they were talking about these challenges that they had, and thought that a way to help them navigate their schooling experiences might be to do this PD.
But it arose from the needs of the teachers,
Yes.
and then you kind of helped them to structure it. So this kind of PD can really apply to teachers at all different types of schools and all different racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds, because it's something that's sort of it's a group that's come together that has specific concerns, and maybe the strategies that you've used, whether it's a homogeneous group or heterogeneous group, they can apply to all different types of teachers. I love the part about coming up with a sentence frame for teachers to use to kind of turn down things and other sort of dilemmas that they're facing.
Yeah.
This is a topic for another time, but I do think this issue of how you have these conversations in a mixed group around race and teaching, and who has the authority and responsibility to teach which kids is really a very fraught issue. So in the work that we did with the community of teacher learners in Seattle, this is where the group kind of fell apart, was this conversation, because it was a very teacher. They were all dedicated to teaching in open schools and very dedicated to teaching kids of color. And then within the group, teachers felt very differently about who could be effective and whose responsibility.
So is it polarized?
Polarized.
So there were people that thought you have to be the same color as the kids, and people that thought if I'm a good teacher, I should be able to reach all kids. Right. And they couldn't see value in both arguments, or probably oversimplifying.
I think it's just a very, it's a very challenging conversation to have.
Yeah.
Seattle is a little bit like Boston in the sense that it's racially very it just, I think it's good to think about how do you make that bridge to having a conversation, but I think in the conversation itself, when we're using Lisa Delta as kind of text, and in the conversation itself, what the happened certain people were being silenced. I mean, it was almost a representation hard. So I think it's, I think the importance of having that safe space, but then how do you then, because really the solution is to come in and think about it. That's interesting.
Travis, do you have a personal opinion yet? going back to your question about should, I realize it's not your question, you extracted it from a talk show, but should black kids be taught by black teachers and white kids be taught by white teachers?
What would be my response to that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in this flat and in this flat and sort of interconnected world, we have to prepare our students to be global citizens, and the way that we do it is by having a diverse workforce. And so, white teachers need to teach black kids, white teachers need to teach Asian kids, black teachers need to teach white kids, black teachers need to teach Asian kids, right? Because in this interconnected world, we need a diverse workforce.
Which is a different way to play off that slide of findings that you had, or I guess they were citations and findings, right? If you read those 4 or 5 studies, you could say, oh, clearly, black teachers have to teach black kids. And yet, it's more powerful to go the direct, it's more complicated, well, they're all complicated, but to think about how do we get our kids so they're taught by many people,
Yes.
highly competent,
Right.
every mix, what the world looks like to us.
And that's the way I tried to sort of shift this narrative that I've been engaging around diversifying teaching force.
Which doesn't exclude things like having the safe space to talk about the challenges for who you are as a teacher. Whether sometimes that safe space is we're all beginning teachers. Sometimes it's we're black teachers, or teachers of color, male teachers of color. You know, sometimes it's we're old white women, whatever. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have? Clearly, you've got us all pondering.
Good.
Yes.
Good.
It's a good topic to monitor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Please call for yourself.
I think the most depressing thing is you got people to come on Friday night from 5 to 7.
Yeah, I love
When you
that.